Hi friends, it's Janine Richards from Q101. Welcome to The Tour Life. Grab your all-access pass and join me behind the scenes of the music industry. Together, we'll discover how to live happier and healthier lives doing what we love. Today's guest started her career touring around the world with the Black Eyed Peas, and then with Lynyrd Skynyrd. She has spent the last several years working at one-of-a-kind Rock Lititz, helping with various touring rehearsals and building up the live event culture on campus. She has also maintained a passion for writing about the live event industry and beyond. In this episode, we discuss Tour Book, which explores a show day in the life of roadies in the live event industry, and how the book can help crew and their friends and family understand what really goes on in a roadie's day-to-day life. We also discuss the importance of asking questions and really listening to the answers in order to make sense of a non-traditional career path, especially if you're really wanting to work on the road. Here is my conversation with Rachel Pfenning Hales. Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me on The Tour Life. It's so nice to have you. We met because of Roadie Clinic, which is really cool. So how are you?
Absolutely. Hey, Janine, I'm super excited to be able to talk to you guys again. It's always fun when work life intersects with personal life, and the more friends in this industry, the better. So I'm glad that we got to sit down.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about your book because you wrote this book called Tour Book, which is really cool. I didn't really know what to expect when I ordered it because I was like, I got to order. I got it from Amazon. But it's actually really, it gives a really awesome in-depth look at what it's like to be a roadie. People usually have no idea what it is. And so it's really awesome to see that. So we'll definitely be talking about that. But first, could you tell me a little bit about how you got started in the industry and how you ended up at Rock Lititz?
Absolutely. I have always loved production. When I was a kid, I did theater growing up, community theater and theaters through school. I was a big nerd. I was the captain of the speech team in high school. When I went to college, totally continued with all of that with theater and TV production. So the idea of putting on shows and working on productions on a team has always, as long as I can remember, has been something that I loved. And I didn't know what job might be waiting for me, but I really hoped it would be somewhere in this production and entertainment world. And I had no idea what that was going to look like. So right after I graduated college, I moved to Los Angeles. I got a job on So You Think You Can Dance, which I knew was only going to be a couple months long. And I thought it would at least get me started. And through that, and we can dive in more, but through that, I ended up meeting the production crew for the Black Eyed Peas. They came through to do the show. We were working together, and it was right time, right place. They needed to hire someone for their upcoming world tour. It was 2009, right as I've Got a Feeling came out. And they asked me, and I was swept into this world I knew nothing about. I thought I'd be prepared. I had done all these different shows growing up and sort of seen the industry, I thought, but I never understood the connection to the scale of shows that might be out there. So I was trying to figure out what the heck I was brought into. I had so much to learn that first year, but it is kind of where the idea for the book came from, because I had a lot of really seasoned people teach me along the way and share their stories and share their lessons learned to make my transition easier or help me deal with some of the mistakes that I've made along the way. I love what we do. I don't think enough people know about it. And I think the work we do should really be celebrated. It's something that I have a real passion for. And kind of following that passion, once I got tied into concert touring, I've been able to, I toured with the Black Eyed Peas for a year. I toured with Lynyrd Skynyrd for 2.5 years. I met my husband on the road. And as we moved to Lititz, is right about the time that Rock Lititz was opening the studio. So I was able to get tied in here. But I think so much of this kind of work is just trusting your path. And I feel really excited about where it's taken me so far.
I love that you're mentioning that trusting your path is so important, especially when, you clearly didn't know what to expect, right? Which is so cool that you wrote this and now people can look to it to kind of get an idea of what it is. But at the time, you really have no idea. And overall, I think in the music industry, a lot of it is kind of trusting your gut feeling and going forward. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. I think, it's funny. This writing tour book took me 6.5 years. It certainly wasn't a quick project, but I don't think I could have done it any faster for myself. But I think back to when I started and getting started in the industry in 2009, I am feeling more confident in what I've been able to experience in my career. But starting this 6 years ago, I was still feeling really young. And all along with Tour Book, it's not my story to tell. I don't have the extent of experience in this industry, but I felt really fortunate that I was welcomed into it, that I got kind of taken in by so many people who had the experience, who have decades of knowledge or have really learned firsthand. And the more I talked to people trying to learn for myself and trying to figure out where I fit and what my career path might be, is when I started hearing all of these stories. And so it's funny how much I've learned from the book and how much writing it, starting it 6 years ago, hearing these stories firsthand and hearing these lessons firsthand from the people who shared their time with me for interviews helped guide my career too. I feel like over the last 6 years, kind of working alongside some people who volunteered their time for this, I feel so fortunate for what it's given me just to hear about it, just to be a part of it. And so I think, you can never know where you're going to end up. And especially in an industry like the live event industry, it's not clear cut. You don't get this entry level position and get, 4 promotions before you get a raise. And then you get to be a manager, and then you get to be a VP, or, I've got some friends who work in a more structured or corporate environment. That's not how it works here, right? We need to be able to show up and be adaptable for what we're going to find. The people who work in this career and what I've come to love about the live event industry professionals, right, is that there's no scenario where this team or this crew can walk into and feel uncomfortable, right? And there's no scenario that a crew walks into and can't transform into exactly what they need it to be. And that was always magical to me, walking into an arena and it's totally empty and it's like, if anything, trash from the night before and there's nothing there. And in 12 hours, less than, this entire magical thing happens and gets built where audience come in and don't even know the work that went into it. I know I always took for granted showing up and just appreciating the show, and knowing the kind of work and dedication and like the lifestyle behind it, to me, is what makes it even more special.
What are some of the things that you realized over those past 6 years that you wished you would have had a better idea about?
I think for me, I feel fortunate, and this is not the way everybody certainly is given access to the industry. But I got my first job in live events and it was being taken out on tour. And there was definitely this moment of like, oh my God, what is happening? What did I agree to? What is this world? You're not just working with your colleagues, you're living with them, you're sharing a bus, you are only seeing them for weeks and months on end. And understanding how to navigate that was challenging. I was really young. I was 22 at the time when I started. And, a lot of things were confusing at 22. I don't know about you at 22. For me, looking back, I'm like, nothing made sense. But especially in this kind of weird world where it wasn't as clear cut as I had been kind of raised to expect it might be. And I think early on, I really wanted to feel like I had it all figured out. I really wanted to seem like I was professional and knew what I was doing, or that I could kind of earn my spot there. And, I think looking back, and something I lean into now more, 14 years into my career than I did in that first year. And I wish I had more, right? Is like, be okay with not knowing, be okay with it being taught stuff. And I think looking back, I was afraid to ask questions because I didn't want to seem like I was inexperienced, right? But how else do you know? And some of the parts of Tour Book literally came from conversations I had with people. Like when you get on the bus, I had a good friend kind of sit down with me and be like, listen, there are some rules when you're sleeping on the bus, right? Like this is not your apartment. This is not your house. But this is a place you should feel comfortable, right? So like you don't fall asleep in any of the lounge spaces, or that center area where you're sleeping is really quiet and you should be respectful of that. And how the bathroom works on long trips. I mean, you take for granted the things that someone coming into this world just doesn't know. So actually, as I was writing Tour Book, I was doing it. I'd always really hoped to get my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. When I was in college, that was another passion I had, and it just had always been on my goal list. And in 2014, actually, as I started working with Rock Lititz, they didn't need someone full time, and I had part time, and I had gotten accepted to grad school. So I was doing freelance. I was doing a lot of things in parallel, and it was all kind of complementing each other. Now that I look back, in the time, it felt totally crazy, but I was able to start Tour Book through that program. And what was really interesting to me is, yes, I was learning a ton about the live event industry through these interviews and being able to work in the industry and kind of be a part of this team here, working on this community for live events. That was all helping each other, right? But from the outside perspective, working with this group of writers who was helping me fine tune the craft and the tone and the voice and all of the writerly stuff, that was super interesting, because I'd share things and I'd have people being like, what's a road case? When you say road case all throughout, like, what is that? Oh, okay. Back way up. Like, you guys are talking about sleeping on a bus. Is that just sleeping like in transition? I'm like, no, there are some nights where that is our bed. You know, you don't get a hotel every night necessarily. And so it's good to complement both, because you realize how little people really know about what we do. And yet almost anyone you talk to has been to a concert, you know, and there's this whole community here supporting it that, again, I keep going back to it, but like, I want to celebrate that. I think it's, personally, I'm that nerd that thinks it's really cool. And these are some of the smartest, most creative people I've ever met. And being able to dive into that is really special to me.
So much of what you said, I mean, is so real. The fact that people don't really get it, the fact that people who think you get it don't really get it sometimes, right? When you look back and you're like, oh, when somebody comes out, you know, and is trying to be in this world, but they don't even really understand like what the words mean and what the day's like and all those things, it really does cause like a rift in communication. The other thing that you also mentioned was the questions, like being okay with not knowing and almost having that expectation that you're not going to know everything.
How are you supposed to know if you've never done it before? And I think there is this really real fear, not just in our industry, but maybe our generation, maybe everybody, or, you know, our culture of like not wanting to come across like you don't know. And I can tell you, I would not have written this book if I wasn't asking like 1,000,001 questions to the point of being annoying, you know, like, but how else are you supposed to learn?
Yeah, questions are, it's interesting. You know, I used to be a high school teacher, and one of the biggest lessons, I mean, I'm not really sure if they learned Spanish, to be honest, but they definitely learned other good lessons. And one of them was the not being afraid to get a no, and the not being afraid to ask with the fear of looking dumb or looking stupid, right? And so that's something that we have to practice. And in a language, I mean, when you're learning a language, like you have that fear of doing everything wrong the entire time. So it was really applicable. But I think that's a skill that like you actively have to practice.
Well, it's asking questions and then actually listening to the answers, which I think is really interesting. I get to do a lot of moderating of panels and sort of live event discussions through my job, where we ask a bunch of questions, right? And I get the question often of how I prepare for these things or how I enter into it. And my number one thing, the more I think about it, you have to want to listen to the answer, right? You have to be interested enough and invested enough in the conversation you're having which I think is sometimes really hard right now, especially as things get busy or you're going 1,000 different ways. Are you actually listening? Are you looking at your text message? And are you checking your email? And are you doing 1,000 other things where your mind's preoccupied, where you're not going to get those connections? And, it's asking the questions, but then paying attention enough to hear the answers and kind of process the answers and being present for that moment makes all of our teams stronger.
Is that something that you got to practice a lot while on the road?
I don't know that I did it 100% well, especially on those first couple tours or legs. Like I said, there is a feeling for sure of just getting tossed into the deep end and just kind of trying to figure it out as we were going. But it's definitely something I got to practice through the tour book. So there are some parts of me in there. I was challenged to kind of, for myself, work myself up almost as like a tour guide and as this amateur figuring out what we're doing. But the stories represented here are just some of the interviews. I have done dozens of interviews, and it's funny because I don't know, interview sounds so formal. We have a small enough industry. You start seeing people enough. And honestly, I think we are all storytellers, right? We've all have this attitude, I think, that we can be adaptable and we can be fluid in what we're doing and we can figure it out. And that leads to some good stories. And so it wasn't really that hard to start to get people talking about their careers or what made it interesting for them. And so like dozens of interviews went into the composite of what this book looks like. And not every single one is written about, but there are some stories that, you hear multiple times. They are shared experiences from different generations of people who have worked in this or shared experiences from the industry. It was fun. It's all listening, right? It's like as these people are talking and you're like, wow, you got started in the industry in this super unconventional, very weird way that no one would believe. But I've actually heard that story 12.5 times so far talking to people. Nobody shows up at their first load in, at least, a few decades ago, in the late 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, there was a lot of stories of people getting sucked into their first load-ins and their first cruise by accident or without totally understanding what they were getting into or showing up to be in a place that they happened to find a crew and start working. I love that. I don't think everybody is driven. I don't think everybody is open enough to take on that kind of experience. But this industry is built around a lot of people who took that kind of experience. And it's like, hey, you want to go on tour? And in my head, literally, when I got asked that the first time, I was like, what does he mean exactly? Like, I kind of knew. I was like, but what do you mean? And being able to say yes and try it, that does seem to be the common theme of who I got to talk to. And that leads to some really exciting people and some really fun stories and perspectives.
So you clearly were able to identify these commonalities throughout all of this storytelling. But did the people that you talked to, did they understand that other people were also going through these same sorts of things? Or did you find that a lot of them felt like they were alone in their experiences?
That's an interesting question because I think it definitely went both ways, depending on the type of story that people were talking about. A lot of these interviews, I would say, happened in a more relaxed setting, right? When we were just sitting around and talking, but every person knew that I was doing this in the context of a book. But following up, and any person whose name is used got a chance to see their section beforehand and had a chance, like we talked about it before it was published, and sharing those pieces with people who were a part of the book afterwards was by far like the most terrifying. This whole experience has been kind of scary, but like that part was hard because it's like, hey, you've shared your story with me and we've had all these conversations, and now it's my attempt to write about it, right? To share my perspective on it. And it was funny because sometimes the comments you would get back are not what I would expect. You've read it. There are some stories that are funny and there's some stories that are totally sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But people shared a lot of personal things with me also. And there are stories that really talk about family life or talk about this feeling of success or talk about what they've given up in the name of the live event industry. And that's really brave to be able to talk about those things, especially if it's something we're not all very practiced at doing. And, it's funny, sharing these sections, the comments I got more than anything were like, I wouldn't wear my hair like that, or I don't drink coffee, or you described me as wearing socks with sandals and I would never do that. I'm like, okay, those are easy edits. The stuff that I was most nervous about sharing, the stuff that really called out some vulnerable subject matters, was usually something people read and they knew they'd shared that with me. And I think seeing it on a page or seeing it in paper validated it a little. It's funny, the stories about the parties or the backstage stuff or the silly stories, those are stories that people share, ridiculous fans or, ridiculous bus antics. Those are stories people share as if I've heard them 1,000 times. And sometimes I had. There are some like legendary stories in this industry that even if it's not your own, you're telling when you're talking to people about how this all works. There were legends that I heard multiple times, right? But it was some of those heavier stuff, like how we deal with our relationships on the road, or how we grow up in the industry, or how we navigate this sort of freelance, miscellaneous crew type of scenario. And, especially I've been working on this before COVID, but given this year, is when I talked to and kind of finalized everybody's sections with them. And so many people are spread out all over the place, and I think it's easy to feel like we don't have this root place or this root connection we can all be together. And I think that is something that more people talked about, like they might be the only ones dealing with. And that's certainly not the case. We all are, myself included. There were so many times people were telling stories where it's like, oh my God, yes, that's me too, If this year has taught us anything, hopefully it is that, we all have more than what it seems just on the surface going on. And, there's more impact there for us as well with each other and with ourselves and with our shows, right? The better we work together as a team, the better our end productions are too.
The storytelling part obviously is the part that lets people know that they're not alone, which I think is really important when coping with a lifestyle that is different from most people's. And I remember I was with an audio engineer for like 5 years, and I just remember not really understanding what he was going through and like kind of taking it personally, sort of thing, because I had been out on the road with him and I wasn't working, so I got to really just kind of enjoy everything. So, but I thought I knew. Like I'm like, oh, I'm watching you go through this, so like I understand what your life is like. But in retrospect, I really had no idea, and it caused a lot of problems because there's also kind of like I feel like there's kind of a self-selecting situation that happens in any career, but definitely also in touring, where sometimes people are able to tour so that maybe they don't have to communicate. And then so when you have to have those situations where it's really important to communicate, especially if you're gone most of the time, that's where it really does affect relationships. And it really can prevent you from getting those roots that you so badly need as a human being.
It's interesting. It's absolutely right. I mean, the connections are hard in what we do. And I think that is something that I feel is unique about our industry, is because these people we work with on our crews, they need to be more than our colleagues, right? They aren't just someone that we show up and sit next to on our computers. Working with a bunch of production vendors, we have the conversation often about how HR fits into this and wanting to be better as an industry and wanting to be a safer environment and more supportive and more inclusive of everybody. And I think it's really easy for someone who doesn't have the context of how we all work together and live together can come in and set down a really, strict black and white list of this is what you can do and this is what you can't do and this is appropriate and this is not. But what gets a little complicated about that is because we have to be more than just, like I said, more than just colleagues. Our work is physical. We are physically there building, assembling, piecing together, where your piece really affects my piece and it affects their piece and their piece and their piece. So there has to be some bleed over. We are working on a timeline. We are counting down to this show where things are going to happen. And for me, that first tour that I did, we were gone 10 months out of that year. When we were home, we would have like 5 days at home and then we'd go back out. And so for me, that year, my social network, my work network, my family through most of this, because it was a challenging year. I didn't know what I was doing. I was learning new things all over the place. You're working odd hours. So when you get off of work at 2 a.m, it's not always easy to call home because people are sleeping, right? And so being able to rely on people within that crew, being able to rely on each other and our busmates, and being able to rely on those friendships. Quite honestly, it could be 10 years between me seeing someone I toured with, and we will still greet each other like family. We will still greet each other like we are good friends, even if we weren't necessarily that close on the tour. Like, it's not like we were hanging out all the time. I know from my experience, I didn't have a lot of time to hang out. Literally felt like I was working all of that, but I was learning, and it was this learning curve to get into feeling comfortable and understanding where I was. But I needed somebody who understood that also. I needed somebody who had been there and could talk to me about those things. And while those roots at home are so important and you need those things and those connections, I think what I've always valued about this industry too is that we inevitably form those connections with each other too. We have to rely on each other that way differently. So it makes those relationships and those connections stronger. There are some people, like I said, no matter how long it's been, I know I could call no matter what I needed. Or you hear the phrase like, you're only as good as your last gig. Well, it's because if someone's been through all that with you and they know they can trust you and rely on you, why wouldn't they want you there again? Right? Why wouldn't they want your support, knowing that you're going to make things easier? You're going to be part of that family or part of that crew in a present way. I mean, that is important also,
Yeah, I mean, the road family is definitely, it's a unique dynamic. Adrienne Biondo, she always has these cute little ways to put things, but she says it's basically it's a human machine, and you're just a part of it, but you're a part of a whole. And I mean, just like you can't really tear apart a human being, you can't really tear apart that family either.
Well, and that's to me, I guess that's what I enjoy most. I say I started doing this in community theater and like high school theater. And honestly, I think a lot of us do get our start that way, or, working with small productions like that at a church or somewhere in our hometowns. And that's how we get exposure to it. And, in some ways it's not that different, right? It's like, it is finding this place where you fit in and knowing that your piece is important, right? Knowing that we all are doing a job to be able to contribute to this final thing. And the fun thing about working in concert touring is that the final thing is this awesome concert where it's like tens and thousands of people show up and they will watch this beautiful unit. And most of the time they don't even consider the fact that there are dozens of individuals behind that curtain, right? You show up and all you see is whoever's headlining and whoever's on stage. And I guess from the outside, that might seem like maybe we're not getting credit or something, but I think for any of us, that's not the focus, right? That's not the goal. You have to check some of that ego at the door because we all have to be there for that to happen. And if one person misses something, and it does trickle down and affect everybody else. And seeing that get accomplished every night, seeing that happen despite the odds, seeing that happen in different environments, seeing that happen even though you showed up and you were expecting X, Y, and Z and none of them were there. Having creative problem solving to think through that and react quickly and find a good solution, like that's gratifying. That feels, to me, that offers me some kind of like finding that end show or that end goal. And now I do, working where I do more of like kind of one-off events. And it's the same kind of idea, right? It's like a bunch of different people pulling their weight to get to this awesome, fun thing where for a moment, it all just comes together. And quite honestly, I think tons of different industries have that and rely on that. We just get the added bonus that there's a very visual, fun, interactive entertainment piece at the end of ours. And we do it really quickly over and over and over again, right? We're not spending a whole year building up a division or a whole month launching a product. We are spending a day putting on this giant production, and we can do it. We do it every time. You like never hear of something not happening. We pull it off. And I think that is what is motivating to me and to a lot of people I talk to, right? Being a part of something bigger, being able to say, I've been there and I have contributed to that feels valuable. It feels important.
What are some of the common experiences that you were told about in all of these conversations when it came to transitions, like transitioning onto the road, transitioning off of the road? Are there things that kind of made sense to you once you started hearing these stories?
Well, it certainly made me feel a little more self-assured and a little more confident in my own start of career, which honestly was a hot mess. I mean, anyone who toured with me during that first year, especially, still since, I guess I'm still probably a hot mess if you talk to most people, but I made a lot of mistakes. I got a lot of things wrong and the learning curve was really steep, but you keep showing up for it and you suck it up and have a little humility and kind of have to own up when you're wrong. And then like, it felt like a hot mess to me, but I pieced my way through. And I guess I heard that a lot. Every person who is starting out, there isn't a very organized or easily accessible way to get into this industry in most any specialty. So one thing you heard a lot about transitions is as you're starting out your career, I was not alone in the fact that most people do feel like they were kind of thrown in or they're piecing it together. I believe that vendors and companies and our industry collectively is making a lot of really big strides to try to fix that or try to address that. I feel fortunate in my career over the last couple of years. I do get to do a lot of educational events, not just I do it for students and I do it for kind of active employees. And I think there is a new drive, it seems like, from a lot of people to figure out how do we better advertise what we do? How do we better talk about what we do to recruit the talent that we want? It's not just going to be hopping in your cousin's van the way it started out, which quite honestly, having that in our roots is part of what makes this passionate, spontaneous industry kind of work. But we are big enough now and the technology is there and we are organized enough that there are better ways to do it. We're all still growing up as an industry. And I think we are working to improve a lot of things because we all experience this sort of jump in and just start swimming, figure it out. Like you're going to find out where you go as you go, which, is always going to probably have a factor in what we do. But if those of us who are already doing this or having some experience can work to make that more accessible to people, I think we'll all benefit from it.
And that's exciting, right?
Yeah, it totally is. I use it all the time, but I was that kid looking for this kind of educational experience. I wanted to work in the entertainment industry. I kind of thought it would be television, production. That's what I had access to at school. Our school held a couple concerts, but it was a really small committee who did it. And, I got my niche somewhere else. And I am kind of embarrassed, honestly, to think back and say, I never made that jump from, oh, I do theater. I could probably like doing events, or I could probably like doing concerts, or I could probably like doing all of these different things. I never made that jump naturally for myself, but I was looking for stuff. I was looking for opportunities to be able to work in an industry just like this. And so now whenever we talk about it, I go back to that. I'm like, I think there are people who are looking for those opportunities. But for me, and kind of in the circle where I grew up near Chicago, like I knew nobody who had done this kind of work at all. I still, the people I know who do this, I've met since I've been a part of it. No one from my like normal civilian life has any idea about, we're often the people who are kind of introducing the idea of all of these individuals who contribute to your big shows. And that's a shame. There's a lot of really talented individuals out there who could make us all, we need the industry to keep growing, right?
Yeah, it's so funny because I grew up outside of Chicago, and the same thing. Like I had no idea. Like I never thought about it. It's like you see the show and like, oh, it's cool. There's like musicians, there's their managers, like whatever. And then like the industry just seems so far away. It's like, how do you even make a jump into it? It just doesn't quite click. And my thoughts were always kind of like, well, if it's in your family, like if, that's what you have exposure to. And so then, you go into it. But something that I think I've noticed over, just from the people that I've talked to, the people I've come into contact with, the people who have made themselves visible in this part of the industry, is that there really is a need to share their story in order to help other people. And like you said, so that you get that guidance that you were lacking from the get-go. And it's really interesting just to see like how much time and effort people are putting in to really embrace them. I mean, the mentorship programs that exist are fabulous. I mean, I had a meeting last night. It was like the Festival of Ideas for the Well Done Foundation. There's some amazing other, mentors who have been touring for years, done amazing things. And you would not believe the willingness of these people to take these kids under their wings. I mean, literally being like, look, I will let you shadow next time I'm in San Francisco. I will let you come hang out with me. I will connect you with whoever you. Oh, that's a great idea that you put together. Let's find a way to make it happen. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant, and it's so beautiful to see.
I honestly think, we're still a little close to it to see all of the silver linings, but I do think this weird COVID pandemic year has given us as an industry some much needed time to just take a pause. The momentum of what we do is very real. We all move very quickly, and it's like one thing's barely over before we're jumping right into the next. And I think for a while there was this feeling that all of these things, it would be great for all of these different kinds of things to happen, right? All these different conversations or mentorships or programs. And I feel inspired by the idea that in this, year, 12, 16 months, however long it's been and will continue to be for people, it seems like a lot of people have made really good use of their time, right? Like you see a ton of different programs starting up that really are following through on what people have talked about and wanting to do and creating these new pathways. And to me, that's so representative of the type of person who does usually find a career in this kind of industry, is that they're not going to sit around, right? It's that, okay, we have a break from our norm. How can we use that to grow? Or how can we use that to create a new project or create this new thing? And I think we're always trying to top ourselves. I think we're always trying to kind of figure out what comes next and how we do the next big thing. And that is usually the show and the technology and the show itself. But when you take away all those shows, people were still innovating. people were still figuring out a way to advance the industry. I'm excited to see what comes next, what grows out of this, because it's something that I find really beautiful. And that sounds totally cheesy and nerdy. And, that is just who I am, right? Like, I think seeing the way these things come together and the way that teams kind of grow to support each other is special in what we do. And seeing that bonding and seeing that growth to support each other and better support the industry. Like, majority of people I talk to, this is not just a job, right? This is more personal than that. And yes, there are a ton of people who do this because their parents did, right? But there are a ton of people who had this idea in their head since they were kids and really strove for and worked towards this. There are people who fell into it and have made the absolute most. And there are people who have sacrificed a lot to be able to continue doing this. And you don't do that if it's not important, right? You don't do that if it doesn't feel bigger than ourselves, Good, bad, and ugly, because life balance is sort of a problem collectively. I understand we are working towards that, but I think we're willing to sacrifice a little bit more because it feels, to me at least, like we get a little bit more as well, and there's ups and downs to that. But for me, the community that I have because of working in this industry is something I would never change. And I feel really, really grateful to be a part of it, and that so many people from it were able to share their stories and their perspective with me. And it is something, for me, Tour Book was something that I started as sort of a school project. But all these people I have so much respect for and so much care for, right, who gave some time, would follow up. They're like, how is it? Where is it? Where is it coming? And that was motivating, right? If this is something that I can express myself in a written way, and that's something that I invest time into, other people have these decades worth of experience, right? And these stories to tell too. And I feel really honored that they gave me the opportunity to try to do it for them, and to do it with them. And it's not just, this would not be any kind of book if it were like me telling my story of the industry. Like, that's not what it is, right? And like, the goal was, live event, concert touring, wrote a memoir. What might that look like? And I feel really grateful to everyone who took their time and their experience to share and contribute.
Could you share a little bit about how the book is broken down? Because I think you did it in a really beautiful and engaging way. It's definitely something that you kind of just like start and then you just read all the way through. So break it down.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This was a long project, and it took us several different forms. But for me, figuring out the structure is actually what made it more accessible to me. And so the structure is a show day. There was one point where I had all of these different interviews, and I do work at Rock Lititz, and I live here in Lititz. So my community is a lot of vendors and a lot of people who are touring sometimes and home sometimes. And I had a ton of interviews at first. At one point, it was getting overwhelming, and the decision really had to come down, like who is this story about? So it is about a touring crew. I tried to show as many different positions on that touring crew as possible and stay as tight to a crew as I was able to. It's not one specific show, but it is set from loadout of one show, where you see the show happen a little bit, you see the loadout, you see everyone hop on the bus, and then it goes straight in to load in the next day, where we see the riggers come, and then we see lights get set up, we see audio. Each chapter counts down an hour closer to showtime, and then the show ends with the show the next day. So there is no specific artist. It's funny, in talking about this with the writing world, that was a big concern for people. Like, why not pick a tour and try to get access for that tour? Or I got so many questions from people being like, why aren't you focused on the artist? Or like, we want to hear more about what happens in the green room backstage. And I'm like, first of all, I still work in this industry and hope to, right? Like those aren't the stories that you just walk around and like tell everybody. But on the second hand, that's not what this is, right? Something I heard a lot from almost everybody is that while we get excited about the elements of the show and maybe you connect with a specific artist, it usually doesn't matter who you're touring with, artist-wise. Whoever's name is on the marquee, that's not why you take a tour. You take a tour because of the production manager. You take a tour because your regular audio crew is doing that tour. You take a tour as crew for the crew you're going to be working with. And so for me, that was something I was non-negotiable about, right? Like I wanted to be sharing these stories of the people who are riding the tour bus and dressed in black and that you're never going to see. And hopefully, as we get towards that, there's obviously tons of stories and perspectives and even tons of roles on the tour that maybe don't get specifically highlighted. But it does look at the different specialties. It looks at some of the things that we will encounter on a regular day. And, I think those of us who have toured know that once you start getting into a groove, show days aren't necessarily that different in and out. And so it was trying to emulate that, right? Just trying to show this sneak peek without sharing too many of our secrets.
I love it. I was telling you before we started recording that like I feel like I need to like send a copy to every person I know that tours and their families. I mean, so that they can kind of understand like what is happening to some extent. But I think it's a beautiful way to even just begin a conversation because sometimes it's really hard to ask, right? Like, just because you don't know how much people want to share. Sometimes that communication is difficult. You're already kind of trying to readjust into regular life. So the last thing you want to talk about at the moment is like what you just did for months, so.
Oh my gosh. My husband and I, while we were dating, like we had this joke, like when I came home from tour, or if he was out for a little bit of the show and would come home, like it would be sort of like a full day of like, don't talk to me. Right? Like I need to be in a different headspace to dive right back into home life, and I think there is a commonality about that in the way that our community goes to work and comes home from work. And Janine, I know that's something that you've been exploring a lot too. So kind of hearing your perspective on that is so valued. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you. Honestly, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It's really great. I hope a lot of people get their hands on it because it really is really valuable. And the validation I think that it gives the industry, the people within the industry who are doing the work, just every soul that literally gives their entire life to this, to putting on these shows is so valuable, especially after, a year of getting it ripped out from under them. But, I see beautiful things ahead. I know you and I are both very aware of the beautiful things that we're all trying to do in order to take care of the humans. And so I'm just wondering, do you see these conversations happening a little bit more where people are starting to see how HR makes sense and how like wellness and taking care of people outside of just what they do in their day and let them go home and figure it out themselves?
Oh, totally. I think this is something looking back, we'll say, especially this year with the break has given us, is the space to start those conversations. And once they're started, it's easier to keep having them. I think there is a whole new generation of people who have come into the industry and decided there are ways that we want to approach things that are a little bit different. And there are some things that I think will always remain the same. And being able to kind of find, what sort of the nature of what we do is, because I do think there's some of that, right? Like walking in and saying you'll never sleep on a tour bus again, probably not something you're going to be able to change, right? But showing up and saying we're going to be committed to hiring more diverse crews, or we're going to be creating safer spaces for those of us who are here, or wanting to support our mental health and being able to check in on our teams in different ways. I think that's something that won't go away. I think that's something that, if anything, we'll just see more of a a commitment to. We see the effects of it, good and bad, right? And it is a small enough industry. I think you hear about the effects of it, good and bad. And I see those conversations continuing in all these different realms. What can we do to talk more sustainably? What can we do to make a positive impact on the industry that we do? Those are all things that we get to grow into and get to explore and have the ability to change, right? So it's like, I think it's part education to other people about what to expect, what this really is, what the reality of this lifestyle is like. Because some people have read this. Like I said, I shared it with definitely the writing crowd in a big way first. And there are so many people who read it being like, fascinating. I would never, ever do that job. Right? But then you get some total weirdos who read it who are like, yes, I need that. That is those 18-hour days. Those are me. I want that. And I think there needs to be a balance, right? It's like, if you're going to put those hard hours into, there's time for self-care, right? If you're going to be hiring crews you trust and you've worked with for years and years and years, I get that. They're your family, they're your crew, but also making room for new people to come in and have that experience and giving that a shot. I think there are ways that we can educate people about the realities of what we do while still committing to make positive change for what comes next, because, there are ways we can improve and we should. And hearing those kind of conversations happening to me is really encouraging and really exciting. And I actually had someone who was in the book actually was talking to me recently about how they're curious if the timing of this will end up feeling like a very pre-COVID experience, and that perhaps the post-COVID experience might be different. And I'll be curious to watch that. I think, who knows what the effects will be, but if we're open to discussing it and exploring it together, we'll figure it out.
And there's book number 2.
Writes itself. Hopefully not another 6 years. My oldest daughter likes to joke it's older than she is. I'm like, yes, took me forever, but I honestly wouldn't have done it any faster, just because I don't know, you meet a lot of people in 6 years and the experience does change. So I can't say enough how fortunate I feel that so many people were willing to talk to me and to let me share their story. And I'm not saying this is everybody's experience, but I'm saying this was enough people's experience. I feel humbled to be a part of it. And I feel really motivated by the people and the creative intelligence of the people we get to work with, right? People who can walk in and fix anything or build anything or wire anything or design anything, getting to be a part of that regularly. Honestly, it's what keeps us all going, I think. So it's something special.
I love it so much, Rachel. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. And we'll definitely keep in touch. And I hope
so, Janine. Thank you for your work as the podcast too. I think you're doing the same kind of work. The more we can talk about what we do and celebrate it, the better it is for all of us.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Tour Life. Please remember to rate and review the show on Apple and Spotify to help us elevate these important conversations. Join our community and get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content. And you'll also be the first to hear about upcoming events and giveaways by connecting with us on socials at The Tour Life Podcast and at Q101 Chicago.
Every story eventually comes to an end. This June, hear the final episode of Season 2 of the hit podcast series In the Red Clay, Durham. In the Red Clay tells the unbelievable true story of Billy Sunday Burt, the most dangerous man in Georgia history. In the podcast that people are calling riveting, incredibly moving, captivating, and addicting. Binge seasons 1 and 2 of In the Red Clay now, wherever you listen.